So this week I've been on a bit of a Last of Us Part 2 kick. Just catching up with reviews. I've been reading a lot of the hot takes from the egghead journalists, which are fairly standard. Just anyone that criticizes The Last of Us Part 2 in any way is some kind of reactionary, toxic, backward gamer who is perpetually sprinkled with a light dusting of Cheeto powder. You know, clearly your opinion, it really is not valid if you have any kind of critiques of this game. Now, we've seen a lot of frustration being played out all over the internet. And when you look at Metacritic, obviously, and you see that the user scores are in the toilet, we're looking at 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10 or something. And in contrast, all of the critics are just heaping praise on this game. We're seeing 10s, we're seeing 9s, and we're seeing a lot of flowery language being thrown around, guys. I mean, this game is being called the Schindlers List of gaming, and I'm not really sure what that's supposed to mean, but I guess it's kind of alluding to the very, very downbeat and unflinchingly miserable atmosphere and message and just general themes of this game. It's been described by Neil Druckmann himself as a story about hate. It's a game about hate, right? As opposed to the first Last of Us, which was a game about love. It was a game about the bond between the two main characters, Joel and Ellie, and that's been cited time and time again as one of the reasons why people love Last of Us Part 1 so much, myself included. I have a suspicion that a lot of the fan backlash actually does have something to do with this extreme violence that we see in this game, even more so than the first Last of Us, because that was a very bleak and realistically violent game, and it certainly made me feel uncomfortable at times to play through, but it never made me want to turn the game off, right? It just enhanced that bleak atmosphere, which is definitely something I would consider appealing. It really just helped the story kind of land even harder. It made the story a little bit more impactful. And in 2013, when the game came out, I think it's safe to say it was one of the most violent games I'd ever played, or at least the violence took on a different tone when compared to the usual gory gaming fare, right? Because obviously violent video games have been a thing since, the dawn of the industry, much to the chagrin of neoconservative talking heads like Jack Thompson or the concerned Christian mothers of the mid-90s. But it almost seems kind of quaint when you look back and you see that the controversial games of that era were Mortal Kombat or Doom, which in retrospect seem extremely tame, even when compared to Last of Us 1, which, although having kind of a cliched zombie apocalypse type setting, which was almost an afterthought, really, it came at the violence in a way that was played way more serious. It was played straight, and it didn't glorify the violence. At least, that seemed to be the point. It almost seemed like Druckmann was directly responding to the ludonarrative dissonance theory that a lot of games journos were throwing out in response to the Uncharted series' just huge body count. And that game is a very lighthearted adventure action, but the insane body count that Nathan Drake racks up as he swashbuckles about the world looking for treasure and, quipping, right? This dissonance in question refers to the fact that the story, the narrative of the game, and the gameplay are fundamentally at odds with each other, and they're not acknowledged in the canon of the game, in universe, right? Because Nathan Drake does not behave, nor is he treated like a homicidal mass murderer of minorities as he travels the world, right, in search of his fortune. And to some, this is just an immersion-breaking travesty, right? Whereas for me, I'm used to suspending my disbelief when playing video games, right? That just was one of the requirements to enjoy games back in the day. But it seems to me like Druckmann wanted to remedy this issue by creating a setting like The Last of Us 1, where it's post-apocalyptic, it's a survival setting, and the main character has been forced to kill or be killed for many years, and the gameplay itself is not at odds with the plot. And it really worked well in The Last of Us Part 1, because although you are mowing your way through many different NPCs, and the violence is stark, it's brutal, the difference is context. It's that the violence makes sense within the setting of The Last of Us Part 1. And even the much debated ending of the game, where Joel kills countless fireflies as he tries to save Ellie, right? The thing that makes that sequence interesting and not immersion breaking is that you can kind of empathize with Joel. You can understand that he'll do anything to prevent Ellie's death, including murder innocent people. And that's a pretty uncomfortable sequence to play as a gamer, but you're not the one making the choices. You're playing a pre-established character who has an understandable motivation to do what he's doing. Now, you don't have to agree with what he's doing. You can find it completely objectionable on a personal level, but you're not Joel. And, it's kind of makes sense for a man like him. I mean, just play the opening of the game, and again, you're treated to a very bleak, very realistic scene where his daughter is killed, and it's very tragic. No ludonarrative dissonance there, as far as I'm concerned. I can imagine a man like Joel doing what he did. And after the credits roll, we, as Egghead journalists, can debate the moral implications of that ending until the cows come home. But ultimately, I think everybody can kind of interpret the ending in their own way. They can be horrified by it. They can write off Joel as this monster for dooming humanity for his own selfish reasons. Or you can look at it as a very human reaction to a very dire and hopeless situation by a flawed man, but also a man who was a father and he lost a daughter and he couldn't face losing another daughter, or at least a surrogate daughter. And I think a lot of fathers could probably relate to Joel's predicament there at the end. Because surely that's the appeal of playing a game that presents itself as morally great. It's that even if you can't influence the moral choices yourself as the player, you can still empathize with the characters and their choices on like a human level. Because the fact is, Joel has to kill to survive. He doesn't kill for pleasure or enjoyment. He may be unhinged after living in a post-apocalyptic hellhole for decades, but it's his character and his journey that contextualizes the extreme violence and justifies it and allows the player to immerse themselves in the character and enjoy the game, enjoy the experience. Survival situations perhaps speak to men especially on a very deep, primal level, because there's an aspect of brutal competition to human history and evolution where it's the survival of the fittest. And in the world of Last of Us Part 1, Joel is the fittest, and he lives with the consequences of this reality, and we as the player understand him for what he is. Now, let's move on to the sequel, because one of the things about The Last of Us Part 2 that kind of separates it from the original is the fact that it's no longer 2013. It's a different world we live in, it's a different industry. And the video game industry is far more political now. Naughty Dog especially, and since the rise of Druckmann and the Druckmann era at the company, their games have become far more overtly political, or at least they contain more of Druckmann's personal, very left-wing politics. And you have to remember, he was only billed as the co-director of Last of Us Part 1. For the sequel, he has total creative control. I can't help but think that perhaps Druckmann realized that there is something kind of problematic about this setup. It's almost might makes right. It's that the beast, Joel, is a necessary evil and thrives in a world of pure natural hierarchy. Because it's somewhat of a right-wing canard to view the world as this very dangerous and violent place that should be navigated with caution, and things like, preserving familial bonds and protecting one's kin. These are conservative, almost paleo-conservative values. And, just judging by the first game's depiction of Joel, he's clearly, I think he's from Texas. I can imagine Joel as a guy who would have voted for Trump, right? And if you look at that ending of the first game through more of a political lens, because clearly, Druckmann is asking us to view this game through a political lens. So here's my analysis. It's that depending on how you judge that ending, really does say something about your personal politics in a way. Because for me, I can understand the value. Wanting to save someone that you would consider your kin or your daughter at all costs. But to an ultra-liberal game developer or egghead journalist, to them there would only be one just choice, which would be to sacrifice Ellie for the good of mankind, right? It's that the needs of the many outweigh the few, or in this case, outweigh Ellie's life. Even though we've spent the whole game, bonding with Ellie, and there's that very human connection there, I guess to a leftist, it wouldn't be worth it. They would ultimately condemn Joel for his choice at the end of that game. And the problem with the sequel is that it does take a side, that the sequel does judge Joel, regardless of his relationship to Ellie. And not only that, but we're expected to feel bad about wanting to save Ellie, and we're also expected to feel bad for even enjoying playing as Joel. The entire plot of Last of Us Part 2 is almost constructed as some kind of lecture or punishment for all of the gamers that interpreted the ending of the first game, quote-unquote, incorrectly. And this is one of my big issues with the sequel. It feels like Druckmann has traded a commitment to immersion and realism for the opportunity to tell way more of a politicized story. The focus on violence, and extreme violence specifically, is not for the express purpose of immersing you in the game world or telling a realistic, gritty, bleak story like the first game. In the sequel, it feels like Druckmann is trying to gross you out, like he's trying to make the player feel as uncomfortable as possible. You're forced to kill dogs, innocent people. The enemies themselves react in the most blood-curdling and disturbing manner when they're killed. They scream out in absolute agony, right? Like, the screams go on forever, it seems like. And that may have worked for a story like the first game that had there was a moral core to the first game, because obviously you could justify the extreme violence because of the character Joel, and that's how you kind of parsed that, right? It seemed like the violence served a purpose. But in the sequel, the violence only serves one purpose, which is to kind of punish you, the player, and make you feel bad. Like, you need to feel guilt. It's like the game wants to elicit this very negative feeling of nihilism, and you're basically playing the role of someone with no morality. Could that be called morally gray? I'd argue that no. This game exemplifies progressive morals, which are themselves defined by this disdain for traditional morality. And I'd argue that, Joel exemplified traditional morality in a lot of ways. He was, a father figure, a protector, right? Whereas in the sequel, you're playing Ellie. And the thing is, did any fans of the first game want to see Ellie turn into this psychopathic monster that she becomes in the second game, who kills countless innocent people? It's so unsatisfying because it completely invalidates Joel's choice at the end of the first game. The fact is, the world would have been a better place if Ellie had just died and a cure was manufactured, right? It takes all of the kind of bittersweet, poetic tragedy out of that ending because, the point was, yes, humanity is doomed, but, in this world, is humanity even worth saving? That's the question. And, Joel having this second shot at fatherhood in a way is more valuable, depending on what your values really are. But this is a game, and people wanted to see more of that Joel and Ellie story when they jumped into this sequel. And what does Druckmann do? He says, no. Joel was always a monster, and he deserved to be killed. And the game even forces you to then play as his killer, right? So you end up playing the last half of the game as Abby, who herself is a completely ridiculous-looking character and only makes sense through a liberal, progressive lens. And what I mean by that is that, gender is a social construct, men and women are equal biologically, therefore, a survivor like Abby is completely within the realm of plausibility, right? Because why couldn't a woman fulfill that same role of brutal survivor that Joel filled in the first game? Because, of course, Abby is supposed to be this Joel analog, and she has her own little kid to protect. And in this case, you have Lev, who is literally a member of the trans community in the post-apocalyptic world of The Last of Us. And, of course, Ellie is also a lesbian. So The main characters are all being subjected to this extreme persecution in this post-apocalyptic world. It's almost like this liberal nightmare in a way of their vision of this future where, all these evil white people that we hear so much about, they really do show their true colors, and you get roving bands of these evil Christian cultists going around, persecuting LGBTQ people and torturing people, smashing their arms with hammers, and just, it's so ugly, but also it kind of does reflect its creators, I think, because I genuinely like the left. They view humanity as evil. They really have this misanthropic worldview, as opposed to libertarians and conservatives who, if society collapsed, well, they'd be the ones who'd save communities. They're the ones with guns. They're the ones who feel like they want to live independently from the state. But this game would have us believe that no, the minute the state ceases to exist, white people and Christians, they're the ones that are going to be terrorizing what's left of society in the most gruesome and perverse manner. I don't buy it, frankly. It sounds like projection. When you see the way that a lot of these hyper-liberal fucking weirdos behave on Twitter or even in public, I mean, look out your window. Look what's happening right now. These people have no empathy for those that they perceive as their political enemies. In this game, I could not enjoy playing a game like this. It's fucking disgusting, frankly. And I loved the first game because the thing is, there was a moral core. There was a heart to it. There is no heart to this horrible story of pointless revenge. And the story's not even just about hey, revenge is bad. No, it's so Joel is such an evil person that even Ellie trying to avenge his death ultimately was not worth it, and all it did was create more pain. So really it's and the way they depict Abby as well is just bizarre. I mean, not only is she completely nonsensical from a character design point of view, but her half of the game, Druckmann spends it trying to redeem her character. So you've seen her kill Joel, but guess what? He kind of deserved it. Even though she's committing these murders, she's also, Joel killed her father, so, here we go. Here comes the muddying of the water in terms of morality. It's that, Joel was obviously a bad person, but, then Ellie's a really bad person for wanting to avenge this man. But, also Abby probably is also a bad person, but she loved dogs. And you're a bad person too for even playing this game and expecting to be entertained. No. Also, human beings are bad. And who isn't a bad person? Well, Mr. Druckmann is the true hero here because his genius allowed this game to come into existence. And you should be grateful to be enlightened in this way. And God forbid you feel like your immersion might be broken by playing as a 90-pound white girl who kills more people than Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando in a more brutal and violent way, to the point where people's jaws are being blown off. And without the heart of the first game, and that kind of father-daughter story, the violence is kind of unjustified. It's just like sicko shit. It's like some kind of snuff film or something. I feel dirty even playing it. It's like the level of cruelty on display. I heard that Druckmann forced his developers to actually watch videos of people actually being killed, like war footage and stuff from Chechnya or the Balkan War. Russians stabbing people, throats being slit. Really? Is this necessary? But I find it very characteristic of the extreme left, because for them, violence is not off the table. It's justified if it's in the name of some kind of political statement. And in this case, who would be entertained by this game if not for some kind of twisted and perverse soy-drinking freak, right? It is simultaneously a leftist feverish nightmare combined with almost like a power fantasy, because the main characters are, they're LGBTQ, right? The idea of gender is very smeared and confused in the game. Abby is completely, a bizarre character, but you're gonna play as her. And is that the same as playing as Joel? No way, this is a completely different ballpark. In hyper-politicizing this game, he's actually reintroduced the infamous ludonarrative dissonance that he was once driven to remedy. I mean, and the fact is, I just don't buy these, these like super dangerous women going around ripping people's fucking faces off with. It's no. It's cringe, and it's pretty obvious what he's doing here, okay? Like, this game is art, in the same way that Hollywood will release they'll release films that are utterly punishing to watch, and all they do is chastise and propagandize the audience, and then you clap and the film wins an Oscar. It's the same kind of thing. I mean, it's pandering to the left, and who even knows if Druckmann actually gives two fucks, really, about progressive values, but we all know the journos, they lap it up, and thus, the game is deemed a masterpiece. And believe me, I am no prude when it comes to violent video games. In fact, one of my favorite games of all time is Manhunt, a game where you're playing as a convicted death row criminal cast in a snuff film. But, I mean, like, the difference is that Rockstar does not expect you, the player, to be taking this insanity seriously. Nor do they present the game itself as some kind of high art, the likes of which the average gamer pleb is incapable of fully appreciating. I mean, that's the kind of attitude that we are working with when it comes to Druckmann's The Last of Us Part 2, the Schindler's List of video games.